In the fall of 2005, the Harrison family vanished from their quiet home in Lake Oswego, Oregon. No note, no struggle, just a pot of stew left burning on the stove, school backpacks still hanging by the door, and silence. The case baffled detectives. Years passed. The house was sold. Life moved on. But 10 years later, in the stillness of that same house, a retired police dog began to act strangely. His instincts, sharpened by years of searching for what others could not see, led his new owner to a forgotten basement wall, and behind it, a truth no one was prepared to face. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this one, make sure to subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. We always love knowing how far these quiet stories can travel. Now, let's begin the story. They say that old houses have souls. When Claire Bishop first stepped across the threshold of the colonial-style home on Oak Creek Drive, she felt only a profound emptiness, a hollow space that mirrored her own. After 30 years of controlled chaos in the emergency room and the sudden, deafening silence that followed her husband David's passing, emptiness felt like a form of peace. She had come to Lake Oswego, Oregon, not to start a new life, but to find a quiet place to sit with the ghost of her old one. The house, with its dormant ivy and windows that seemed to gaze wistfully at the lake, promised a gentle solitude. But solitude, she quickly learned, was a different beast than loneliness. In the first few weeks, the silence of the house was so absolute it seemed to have a weight of its own. It settled in the dust motes dancing in the afternoon sun and echoed in the vast space of the bed she now occupied alone. It was in this quiet that she decided she needed a companion, not for conversation, but for the simple, grounding presence of another heartbeat in the house. That was how she found Max. He was a Belgian Malinois, a retired K-9 from the Portland Police Bureau, whose career had been cut short by a shrapnel injury to his left hind leg. He carried a faint, almost imperceptible limp and the quiet dignity of a seasoned warrior. In the shelter's file, he was described as highly intelligent, loyal, and in need of a calm environment. Claire saw a kindred spirit, another retiree carrying old scars, looking for a place to rest. Their life together quickly found a rhythm as gentle as the Oregon mist that rolled off the lake each morning. They would walk the winding paths under the towering Douglas firs, Max's pace steady and measured, his presence a silent assurance at her side. In the evenings, he would lie on the hearthrug, his head on his paws, watching her as she read by the fire. He was a creature of profound stillness, yet his quiet attentiveness filled the house more than any conversation could. For the first time in a year, Claire felt a fragile peace begin to blossom in the barren landscape of her grief. The house on Oak Creek Drive was becoming a sanctuary. This fragile peace lasted for 3 weeks. Then, the silence began to break. It started subtly. Max, who had explored every inch of the house with a professional's disinterest, developed a fixation on the basement. At first, it was just a low whine at the top of the stairs, a sound Claire dismissed as a reaction to the damp, musty air of an old foundation. "It's just mice, old boy," she'd murmur, patting his head. As a doctor, she was trained to diagnose based on evidence, and a vague whine was not enough to warrant concern. But Max's behavior escalated. He began to bypass their evening ritual by the fire, choosing instead to lie at the basement door, alert and unmoving. When she finally let him down, he bypassed the laundry area in the old wine cellar, making his way directly to the far end of the basement, a section the previous owner had used as an art studio. There, he would stand before a specific section of the stark, plaster-covered wall on the eastern side, his body tense, his nose twitching as he sampled the still air. Claire tried to rationalize it. An old pipe, a trapped squirrel, the lingering scent of turpentine. Her logical mind, the part of her that had diagnosed life-threatening conditions based on faint murmurs and subtle symptoms, offered a dozen plausible explanations. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through boxes in an attempt to finally make the space her own, she discovered something that shifted her perspective. Tucked away in the back of a stiff, long-forgotten drawer in the studio, her fingers brushed against a small, wooden object. It was a music box, its paint chipped, with a tiny, stationary ballerina on top. She wound the small key, and a delicate, haunting melody filled the damp air. It was a tune so melancholic, so achingly sad, it felt completely out of place in a child's toy. A small, tarnished plaque on the bottom read, "For our Lily. May you always have music. Lily Harrison." Claire remembered the name from the realtor's brief, somber mention of the family who had lived here before, the family who had vanished a decade ago. The music felt like a whisper of their tragedy, a tangible piece of the sorrow that seemed to have soaked into the very walls of the house. She placed the music box on a shelf, the tune still echoing in her mind. It was later that evening that Max's behavior reached its tipping point. He was no longer just whining or sniffing. Claire found him in the basement, pressed against the cold eastern wall. He wasn't scratching or barking. He had laid his great head against the plaster, and from his throat came a low, mournful keen, a sound of profound, empathetic pain. To her, a diagnostician by trade, it was a symptom she could no longer ignore. Animals felt fear, they sensed danger, but this was something else entirely. This was the sound of a creature bearing witness to suffering. The logical explanations fell away, replaced by a cold, rising dread. Max was not reacting to a mouse or a draft. His trained senses, honed over years of searching for the lost and the hidden, were telling her something. His entire being was focused on that single, blank stretch of wall, as if he could see right through the plaster and studs to the unbearable secret hidden within. And as Claire stood there in the dim light of the basement, with the ghost of a sad melody in her ears and her loyal companion grieving for something she could not see, she finally understood. The house did have a soul, and it was screaming. The keening of the old K9 had shattered Claire's carefully constructed peace. It was one thing to live with the quiet ghosts of her own past, but another entirely to suspect she was sharing her home with the palpable, ongoing sorrow of others. The doctor in her, the woman who had spent a lifetime triaging chaos, took over. She needed information, facts to anchor the chilling intuition that had begun to take root in her mind. The next morning, while Max patrolled the basement with a renewed, restless energy, Claire sat at her laptop, the name Harrison Family typed into the search bar. The digital archives of the Lake Oswego Review painted a story that was both sensational and agonizingly vague. 10 years ago, in the fall of 2005, the Harrison family had vanished. David, a respected linguistics professor at Lewis and Clark College, Sarah, a gifted violinist with the Oregon Symphony, and their 10-year-old twins, Leo and Lily. They hadn't just left, they had evaporated from the center of their lives. The articles detailed the unsettling scene left behind. The Sunday paper lay unread on the driveway. A pot of stew, scorched and dry, sat on the stove. School backpacks hung on their hooks by the back door, filled with homework and crayon drawings. It was, the lead detective at the time was quoted as saying, as if they were lifted away in the middle of a single, ordinary breath. The investigation had been exhaustive. Friends, family, and colleagues were interviewed, but no one had a plausible explanation. There were no signs of a struggle, no ransom notes, no drained bank accounts. Just a void. The face of the lead detective, Marcus Thorne, looked out from the grainy news photos. He had the weary, resolute expression of a man burdened by a puzzle he couldn't solve. The case had eventually gone cold, leaving the house on Oak Creek Drive as a silent monument to an unanswered question. Claire scrolled through photos of the family, their smiling faces radiating a warmth that felt like a cruel irony. David, with his kind, academic eyes, Sarah, her head tilted as if listening to some distant music, and the twins, Leo and Lily, with identical bright, curious gazes. As she looked at the photo of Lily, Claire felt a chill. The little girl in the picture was holding a music box, the very same one now sitting on a shelf in her basement. It wasn't just a forgotten toy, it was a relic, a final, tangible piece of a little girl's life. That evening, a storm rolled in from the Pacific, lashing rain against the windows and rattling the old house to its bones. The wind howled through the Douglas firs, a sound that usually brought Claire a sense of cozy isolation. Tonight, it felt menacing. Max, agitated by the storm and the unseen presence in the basement, refused to settle. He paced the length of the living room, his claws clicking on the hardwood floors, his gaze fixed on the basement door. All right, I get it," Claire said, her voice a low murmur. She knew she wouldn't be able to rest until she had confronted whatever it was that so disturbed her stoic companion. She followed him down the creaking wooden steps, a heavy flashlight in her hand. The basement was colder than usual, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something faintly acrid. Max went straight to his post at the eastern wall, his body rigid, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Claire swept the beam of her flashlight across the surface. It was just a wall, imperfectly plastered, painted a sterile white, no different from any other wall in the house. She pressed her ear against it, her own breath held tight in her chest. For a long moment, there was nothing but the thrumming of her own blood and the distant roar of the storm. She was about to pull away, to chide herself for letting an old house and a restless dog fuel her imagination, when a clap of thunder shook the foundation. And in the brief, echoing silence that followed, she heard it. It was not a mouse. It was not the groan of old pipes. It was a sound so faint, so utterly frail, that her mind almost refused to register it. A soft, rhythmic scratching. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. It was deliberate, methodical, and filled with a desperate, hopeless patience. Her blood ran cold. She stumbled back, the flashlight beam trembling in her hand. Max let out a single, sharp bark, a sound not of aggression, but of confirmation. You hear it too, don't you? Claire's medical training kicked in, overriding the wave of terror. This was a symptom, a sign of life. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy with shock. She found the number for the Lake Oswego Police Department, her heart hammering against her ribs. There's someone in my house, she said, her voice a strained whisper, barely audible over the storm. No, not an intruder. They're inside the wall. I think you need to come. It's the Harrison house. Hanging up, she didn't retreat upstairs to the relative safety of the main floor. She stayed there, at the bottom of the steps, her flashlight beam fixed on the wall. She and Max stood vigil together, two sentinels guarding a tomb that, impossibly, was still breathing. The storm raged outside, but the true tempest was now contained within the four walls of her basement, waiting to be unleashed. The arrival of the police was a surreal intrusion into the storm-lashed quiet of Oak Creek Drive. The flashing blue and red lights painted fleeting, frantic strokes across the wet windows, a stark contrast to the house's decade-long slumber. A younger officer, his face etched with a polite skepticism, met her at the door, but Claire's composure, the calm authority of a former ER doctor, gave him pause. The sounds are coming from the basement, she stated, not as a panicked homeowner, but as a physician reporting a critical finding. Down in the cold, damp air of the studio, another figure was waiting. He was older, his shoulders slightly stooped with the weight of years, but his eyes were sharp and missed nothing. He introduced himself as Detective Marcus Thorne. Claire recognized him instantly from the old news clippings. The ghost of the Harrison case had returned to the scene of his greatest failure. Thorne's gaze swept the room, lingering on the blank eastern wall where Max now stood, a silent, unwavering statue. The detective looked from the dog to Claire, his expression a mask of professional weariness. Ma'am, he began, his voice raspy, this house has been searched by every expert we had 10 years ago. We used thermal imaging, sounding equipment. There's nothing there. Your equipment didn't have a soul, Claire replied, her voice low but firm. He does. She gestured to Max, he's a retired K-9. His name is Max. And for 3 weeks, he has refused to leave this spot. Tonight, I heard it myself. A scratching sound. Thorne knelt, running a hand over Max's head. The dog didn't flinch, merely turned his gaze to the detective for a brief moment before focusing back on the wall. It was a transfer of duty, an acknowledgement of a shared purpose. Thorne, a man who had worked with dozens of K-9s in his career, understood the language of that unwavering focus. He rose slowly, his skepticism giving way to a grim curiosity. He knocked on the wall, the sound a dull, solid thud. Nothing. He pulled out a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a sharp circle on the plaster. He examined the surface with the meticulous attention of a man looking for a flaw in a perfect lie. And then he saw it. It was almost invisible, a hairline fracture in the paint, not from age, but from a seam. A perfect, subtle rectangle, about 6 feet high and 3 feet wide, had been plastered over and repainted with painstaking care. Give me a sledgehammer and a pry bar, Thorne said to the young officer, his voice stripped of all weariness, now sharp and commanding. And call the paramedics. Tell them to be ready. The first blow of the sledgehammer was a deafening violation of the house's silence. Plaster dust exploded into the air, smelling of chalk and time. With each strike, the tension in the room coiled tighter. Claire stood back, her hands clasped, her mind a whirlwind of impossible possibilities. Max whined softly, a sound of anxious anticipation. As they pried away the first large section of plasterboard and insulation, a wave of stale, suffocating air washed over them, the smell of unwashed bodies, of despair, of life clinging on in the dark. Thorne shone his light into the cavernous blackness beyond. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the abyss, a hand emerged. It was skeletal, pale as bone, the skin translucent over a latticework of veins. It reached not with aggression, but with a slow, desperate tremor, as if seeking the warmth of the light. A collective gasp went through the room. Thorne grabbed the hand, his voice thick with emotion. We're the police. You're safe. We're getting you out. The rescue that followed was a slow, agonizing ballet of careful movements and hushed commands. Paramedics crowded into the small space, their faces grim. One by one, they were brought out of the darkness they had inhabited for a decade. David Harrison, his academic's beard now a matted, gray tangle, his eyes wide and vacant. He clung to the hand of his wife, Sarah, whose once vibrant violinist hands were now frail and scarred. Her beauty was still there, but it was a ghost of itself, etched with years of unimaginable hardship. Behind them came the children. They were no longer children. Leo and Lily, now 20 years old, were tall and painfully thin, their skin having the pallor of cave-dwelling creatures. They blinked against the light, their movements stiff and uncertain. They huddled together, two saplings that had grown twisted in the dark, their faces blank masks of profound shock. Claire, drawing on decades of experience, moved forward to help. She knelt beside Sarah, checking her pulse, murmuring words of comfort. The woman's eyes focused on Claire's face for a fleeting moment, a flicker of recognition in the vast emptiness. Her lips parted, and a single, cracked whisper escaped, a name carried on a breath of stale air. Julian. Before Claire could ask, Sarah's eyes rolled back, and she slumped into the waiting arms of a paramedic. The name hung in the air, a key suddenly appearing for a lock no one had been able to find. As the last of the Harrison family was carried up the stairs and out into the rain-swept night, Leo, the boy, paused. He turned his head and his vacant eyes fell upon Max, who was sitting quietly in the corner, his duty done. For the first time, an expression crossed the young man's face, not fear, not relief, but a deep, primal curiosity. He looked at the dog, this creature of the light, this emissary from a world he barely remembered. It was a silent acknowledgement, a connection forged across an impossible divide. Then, he too was gone, leaving Claire and Thorne standing in the wreckage of the basement, the gaping black hole in the wall a testament to a horror that had finally, terribly, been brought to light. The news of the Harrison family's discovery swept through Lake Oswego like a wildfire, a shocking, macabre story that resurrected old ghosts and unanswered questions. For the public, it was a horrifying spectacle. For the family, it was the beginning of a second, more complicated ordeal. They were taken to OCHSU Hospital in Portland, where they were placed in a secluded wing, shielded from the world's ravenous curiosity. Their physical recovery had begun, but the psychological wounds ran far deeper than any doctor could immediately assess. Meanwhile, for Detective Marcus Thorne, the name Sarah Harrison had whispered was not just a clue, it was a reckoning. Julian Croft, Sarah's younger cousin, an architect of considerable local renown, known for his minimalist, almost obsessively clean designs. Thorne remembered him from the initial investigation 10 years ago, a soft-spoken, cooperative young man who had expressed profound grief for his missing relatives. He had an alibi, a business trip to Seattle, confirmed and airtight. He had been dismissed as a person of interest early on. It was a mistake that had haunted Thorne for a decade, though he hadn't known why until now. A warrant was issued immediately. Thorne and his team descended on Julian Croft's condominium in Portland's Pearl District. What they found inside was not the lair of a madman, but something far more chilling, the sanctuary of a mind obsessed with absolute control. The apartment was immaculate, a sterile shrine to order. There was not a speck of dust, not a misplaced object. Books on philosophy and architectural theory were arranged on the shelves not by author or title, but by the precise color gradation of their spines. In the closet, his gray and black shirts hung in military-perfect rows. There were no family photos on the walls, no personal trinkets, no hint of a life lived with messy, human emotion. Instead, the walls were adorned with framed architectural blueprints, rendered with an artist's hand. They were detailed schematics of the secret room in the basement of the Oak Creek house. He hadn't called it a prison. He had labeled it the sanctuary. The labels on the drawings were meticulously scripted in a fine, elegant hand. Zone of sustenance, area for contemplation, circadian lighting system simulated. He had designed their tomb as a masterpiece of form and function, a living sculpture. He hadn't seen himself as a jailer. He had seen himself as a curator, preserving his precious collection from the chaos of the outside world. In a locked file cabinet, they found his journals. They were not the ravings of a lunatic, but the cold, detached observations of a scientist. For 10 years, he had chronicled the lives of the Harrisons. He logged their food intake, their sleep cycles, their conversations overheard through a hidden microphone. He wrote of Sarah not with love, but with a disturbing, proprietary admiration. Sarah's tone was melancholic today, one entry read. The confinement is purifying her art. The world's noise has faded, leaving only the pure sound of her spirit. He believed he was not destroying her, but refining her. Back at the hospital, Claire Bishop felt an ethical pull to see the family she had found. As a former physician, she knew the delicacy of their situation, but she also felt a strange, unspoken responsibility. Thorne granted her access, hoping her familiar, calm presence might be a bridge for them. She found them in separate but adjoining rooms, each grappling with their re-entry in their own way. David Harrison sat by a window, staring out at a world that had moved on without him. He was lost in a thick fog of guilt and silence, barely speaking. Sarah, fragile as glass, would flinch at any sudden noise, her hands often trembling as if still holding the phantom weight of her violin. It was the twins who fascinated and worried Claire the most. Lily was withdrawn, her eyes wide with a constant, simmering fear. She clung to her mother, refusing to be left alone, as if the vastness of the hospital room was more terrifying than the cramped darkness she had always known. Leo was different. He was quiet, but his was a watchful silence. He roamed his room like a caged animal finally given more space, touching the smooth walls, staring at the television screen with a blank, uncomprehending gaze. When Claire entered his room, accompanied by Max, who had been cleared by Thorne as a potential therapy animal, Leo stopped. He didn't look at Claire. He looked at the dog. He slowly knelt, his movements hesitant. He reached out a hand, not to pet Max, but to simply hover it over his fur, as if feeling his warmth. Max, sensing the boy's fragility, remained perfectly still, letting out a soft, low sigh. For the first time since his rescue, Leo spoke. It was a single word, uttered in a voice rusty from disuse, a word that held a universe of meaning. "Friend," he whispered. The connection was instantaneous, a silent pact between a boy who had known only darkness and a dog who had brought him into the light. In that moment, Claire realized the path to healing for this family would be as complex and fraught with peril as their decade of captivity. And as she watched the boy and the dog, she had the unnerving feeling that the monster who had built their prison was not finished with them yet. His masterpiece had been disturbed, and a man like Julian Croft would not suffer such an imperfection to stand. Julian Croft had vanished as cleanly as his victims once had. His car was found abandoned at Portland International Airport, a deliberate misdirection designed to send the police on a fruitless, nationwide hunt. But Julian hadn't fled. He was a creature of his own meticulously crafted environment, and he had no intention of leaving the stage. His masterpiece had been vandalized, his family taken from him, and now, a new player had entered the game. The game had simply shifted from one of quiet curation to one of active engagement. The first move was a subtle one. An anonymous email arrived in Detective Thorne's inbox. It contained no text, only a single, high-resolution image of a chess piece, a white queen, standing alone on a board. Thorne understood the message immediately. It was a taunt, a declaration of intellectual superiority. Julian wasn't just a kidnapper. He was a narcissist who needed an audience to appreciate his brilliance. For Claire Bishop, the game was far more personal. The sense of peace she had briefly found in the house on Oak Creek Drive was gone, replaced by a low, humming anxiety. It began with small things, things she could almost convince herself were imagined. The garden gate, which she was certain she had latched, found slightly ajar in the morning. A book on architectural theory she had never seen before, left neatly on her porch swing. They were whispers, not shouts, Julian's way of saying, "I am here. I am watching." Thorne had insisted on a police presence, a patrol car that drove by hourly, but both he and Claire knew it was a flimsy shield against a man like Croft. "He won't try to harm you, not yet," Thorne had told her, his voice grim over the phone. "He sees you as an intellectual equal now. The woman who solved his puzzle. He's trying to understand you." The thought was more chilling than any physical threat. She refused to be driven from her home. Leaving would be a concession, an admission of fear. This house, the site of so much suffering, had also been the site of a miraculous rescue. It had become a part of her story, and she would not surrender it to the ghost that haunted its periphery. She and Max began a new routine. Their evening walks were shorter, confined to the perimeter of the property. Max, ever the sentinel, seemed to feel the unseen eyes as keenly as she did. His body was perpetually alert, his ears swiveling at the slightest rustle in the dense Oregon woods that bordered her yard. He would often stop and stare into the darkness, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The turning point came a week after the rescue. Claire had just finished a long phone call with one of the hospital's psychiatrists, discussing Leo's slow but steady progress. Exhausted, she had gone upstairs to her bedroom. As she pulled back the covers of her bed, her hand brushed against something small and cold. It was the music box. Lily's music box. She was certain she had left it on the shelf in the basement. Her heart ceased. She backed away slowly, her eyes scanning the room. Everything was in its place. The window was locked. Nothing was disturbed. But the music box was a clear, undeniable violation. He had been in her room, in her most private space. He had walked where she slept, breathed the air she breathed. She fumbled for her phone to call Thorne, but as she did, her eye caught a tiny, dark speck on the side of the music box, near the winding key, that hadn't been there before. Leaning closer, she saw it was the lens of a micro camera, no bigger than a pinhead. The blood drained from her face. He hadn't just been in her house. In a way, he had never left. He had been watching her since the beginning. Suddenly, Max erupted from downstairs. A furious, frantic barking, the sound of a protector confronting a direct threat. It was not his low growl of warning, but the all-out alarm of an imminent breach. Claire's training kicked in, adrenaline surging through her. She ran to her bedroom window, which overlooked the backyard. For a moment, she saw nothing but the manicured lawn bathed in the cold glow of the security lights. Then, at the very edge of the woods, a figure stepped out from behind the massive trunk of an old oak tree. It was just a silhouette, a man of average height and build. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted slightly as if listening to Max's frantic barks. He made no move to approach, no threatening gesture. He simply stood there, an observer making his presence known. He held his position for a long, terrifying moment, then raised a hand in a slow, almost courteous wave. And just as quickly as he appeared, he melted back into the shadows of the forest, leaving behind only the sound of a terrified dog and the chilling certainty in Claire's mind that the game had just entered a new, far more dangerous phase. The silent wave from the edge of the woods was a declaration of war. Julian Croft was no longer a phantom playing with clues and emails. He was a physical presence, a predator testing the boundaries of his territory. Thorne increased the police patrols, and a junior officer was stationed in a car at the end of her driveway from dusk till dawn. But Claire knew these were merely deterrents, not solutions. Julian was a strategist. He wouldn't be caught by a uniformed officer in a marked car. He would only be caught if someone could anticipate his uniquely twisted logic. Feeling the police investigation was moving with a frustrating, procedural slowness, Claire decided on a new course of action. She couldn't outmaneuver Julian physically, but perhaps she could understand him. And there was only one person alive who had spent a decade inside the labyrinth of his mind, Leo Harrison. Her visits to the hospital took on a new purpose. They were no longer just the compassionate check-ins of the woman who had found them. They became quiet, patient sessions of building trust. She would bring Max with her every time, knowing the dog was the key. While doctors and therapists armed with questions and clipboards often caused Leo to retreat into his shell, Max's silent companionship created a space of unconditional acceptance. Claire would sit on the floor with them, not speaking for long stretches, simply being present. She would talk softly about her own life, about her late husband, about her work in the year, stories of a world Leo was struggling to comprehend. She never asked him directly about the 10 years of darkness. Instead, she asked about the stories Julian used to tell him, the books he was made to read. He said the world was messy. Leo offered one afternoon, his voice barely a whisper as his hand rested on Max's back. The dog let out a contented sigh, his presence a warm anchor for the boy's fragile words. He said feelings made people weak, unpredictable. He liked things he could predict. It was the most Leo had said to anyone. Claire listened, not as an interrogator, but as a fellow survivor of loss. She recognized the pattern. Julian wasn't just controlling their bodies. He was trying to deprogram their humanity, to replace the messy chaos of love and fear with the cold, clean lines of logic and order. He liked to draw, Leo continued, a flicker of memory in his distant eyes. He drew all the time. He called them blueprints for a better world. He said the house was just a prototype. This was it, the breakthrough Claire had been hoping for. Did he ever show you these drawings, Leo? She asked gently. Leo fell silent for a long time, his gaze lost somewhere in the past. Claire waited, holding her breath. Finally, he nodded slowly. Sometimes, when I was good, he said I was the only one who understood the beauty of the lines. He said Lily. Lily was too much like Mom. Too much music in her. A profound sadness washed over Claire. Julian had not only imprisoned them, he had pitted them against each other, grooming one child for his distorted worldview while dismissing the other. She pushed a blank sketch pad and a charcoal pencil across the floor toward him. If you remember any of it, Leo, any line at all, it could help. It could help keep Lily safe. The mention of his sister's name seemed to focus him. With a trembling hand, Leo took the pencil. At first, his strokes were hesitant, uncertain. But then, a decade of muscle memory, of images seared into his mind in the dim light of their prison, took over. He began to draw. He drew sharp angles, interconnected chambers, and spiraling staircases. It wasn't a house. It was a complex, subterranean structure, a sophisticated bunker. While Leo drew, Lily watched from the doorway of her room, her expression a mixture of fear and resentment. She saw her brother connecting with this outsider, this woman and her dog from a world she didn't trust. She saw him choosing their world over the one she had known, the only one that had ever felt safe, however terrible it might have been. A silent schism was forming between the twins, a fracture line created by Julian years ago, now cracking wide open under the pressures of a freedom they had never been prepared for. Leo finished his drawing. He pushed the pad back to Claire. It was incomplete, a fragment of a much larger design, but one feature stood out. A circular central chamber built directly beneath a distinct, recognizable landmark, the old, abandoned Hawthorne textile mill in Portland, a place known for its deep, labyrinthine basements. He called it the Ark, Leo whispered, his task complete. A place to survive the flood. Claire looked at the drawing, then at the haunted face of the young man who had produced it. She now held a map, not just to a location, but to the very architecture of Julian Croft's madness. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was preparing his Ark for new passengers. The sketch Leo had drawn was more than a clue, it was a key. When Claire brought it to Detective Thorne, the weary resignation on his face was replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. The Hawthorne textile mill, a decaying brick monolith on the industrial outskirts of Portland, had been abandoned for 30 years. Its vast, multi-level basements were a notorious maze, a place urban explorers whispered about, but even the homeless avoided. It was the perfect real-world embodiment of Julian Croft's twisted psyche, ordered in its original design, now chaotic and forgotten by the world. It was the perfect place to build an Ark. Thorne assembled his team with quiet urgency. This would not be a clumsy raid, but a meticulous, surgical operation. A SWAT team was briefed, blueprints of the old mill were studied, and surveillance was established. They would let Julian believe he was the one in control, the master puppeteer. They would set a trap and wait for the spider to walk into his own web. The plan was to create a subtle pressure point. Thorne's office leaked a carefully fabricated story to a single, trusted journalist. Police closing in on a prime location in Croft case. It was a calculated risk, designed to make Julian feel his timeline was accelerating, to force him out of the shadows and into his prepared sanctuary. The night of the operation was cold and clear. The air hummed with a silent, electric tension. Thorne and his team were set up in a mobile command unit a block away from the mill, watching multiple camera feeds from operatives hidden in the surrounding derelict buildings. The SWAT team was in position, shadows within shadows, ready to move on his command. They watched. They waited. The hours ticked by. The moon climbed higher in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows from the mill smokestacks. 1 o'clock. 2 o'clock. The only movement was the wind skittering debris across the empty streets. A cold knot of doubt began to form in Thorne's stomach. Julian was too careful, too much of a control freak to be flushed out so easily. This felt wrong. His phone buzzed, shattering the tense silence of the command unit. It was the head nurse from the hospital's psychiatric wing, her voice frantic. "Detective, it's Lily Harrison. She's gone." The floor seemed to drop out from under Thorne. While his entire force was focused on a pile of bricks and mortar, the true target had been left vulnerable. He listened, his face turning to stone, as the nurse explained. Lily had been growing increasingly agitated all day. A little after midnight, she had complained of a headache and asked for a glass of water. The nurse on duty, a young trainee, had left her for no more than 2 minutes. When she returned, Lily's bed was empty. Her window was unlocked and open. On the pillow, where the girl's head had been, sat a single, perfect white rose. Thorne slammed his fist on the console. He was never coming here, he hissed, to no one in particular. This was a diversion. He was playing us the entire time. He raced back to the hospital, his mind reeling. How had Julian communicated with her? How had he convinced her to leave? The answer lay with Sarah Harrison, who sat numbly in her daughter's empty room, clutching a piece of paper a security guard had found in the trash bin. It was a note, printed in the same elegant, architectural font as his journals. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. "My dearest Lily," it read. "They don't understand, do they? They want to force you into their noisy, chaotic world. But I have kept our home safe. A new home, a better one, free from the weak ones who have been tainted. It is time to come home. Come to the light that never goes out. The light that never goes out. A lighthouse." As this new, horrifying realization dawned on Thorne, Claire Bishop, miles away in her quiet house, received a final, chilling invitation. An email appeared on her laptop screen. The sender was anonymous, but she knew instantly who it was from. There was no image this time, no chess piece. Just a few lines of text. "He was a fool to think a cage of bricks could hold me. She was a fool to think she could ever truly leave. You, Dr. Bishop, are different. You are the only one who appreciates the beauty of a well-designed system. The only one who saw the logic behind the walls. Come and witness the new beginning. Come and see what true sanctuary looks like. Alone." Below the text was a set of coordinates, pointing to a desolate spot on the rugged Oregon coast, a place where a decommissioned lighthouse stood sentinel over the churning Pacific. It was an invitation to the final act, and Claire knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she was the only one who could accept it. The coordinates on the screen were not just a location. They were a challenge, a final, intimate summons from a mind that had elevated its madness to an art form. Claire Bishop sat in the quiet of her study, the glow of the laptop illuminating the resolute set of her jaw. She thought of Thorne, of his protocols and tactical teams. She knew what he would say, that she was a civilian, that this was a job for the police, that walking into Julian's chosen territory was suicide. And he would be right, from a logical standpoint. But Julian Croft did not operate on conventional logic. He operated on a twisted aesthetic of control and intellectual vanity. He didn't want a hostage, he wanted an audience. He wanted a witness who could, on some level, comprehend the scope of his vision before he brought the curtain down. She was that witness. And in her heart, a place where the physician's oath to do no harm still echoed, she knew that Lily Harrison's only chance lay not with a SWAT team, but with a single, calm voice that could penetrate the fortress of Julian's delusion. She made the decision with the same quiet finality she had once used to declare a time of death. She would go. Before she left, she walked over to Max, who was sleeping at her feet, his body occasionally twitching in a dream chase. She knelt and buried her face in the thick, warm fur of his neck, inhaling his familiar, comforting scent. "You stay here, old boy," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she refused to let surface. "You've done your part. This one's on me." She locked the door securely behind her, leaving him barking in confused protest, a sound that pained her more than she could have imagined. This was a journey she had to make utterly and completely alone. The drive to the coast was a 2-hour pilgrimage through the dense, cathedral-like forests of the Oregon Coast Range. The towering pines and firs formed a dark canopy overhead, and the winding road seemed to be leading her not toward the ocean, but deeper into the heart of some ancient, foreboding land. Her hands were steady on the steering wheel, a testament to years of performing delicate procedures under immense pressure. Her mind, however, was a storm of calculation and memory. She thought of David, her late husband. He had been a historian, a man who believed that understanding the past was the only way to navigate the present. "Everyone has a narrative, Claire," he used to say. "You just have to listen long enough to hear it." She was driving now to listen to a monster's narrative, hoping to find a single flaw, a single contradiction she could use to unravel it. She thought of her career in the emergency room. She had faced down armed and delirious patients, had delivered devastating news to grieving families, had held the hands of the dying. She was no stranger to the precipice where life and death met. The fear she felt now was different. It was not the visceral fear of violence, but the intellectual dread of confronting a mind so broken, so utterly convinced of its own righteousness, that it had become a force of nature. Could you reason with a hurricane? Could you negotiate with an earthquake? As the road descended from the mountains, the air changed. It grew heavy with the salt of the sea, and the dense forest gave way to windswept bluffs. She stopped at a small, weathered gas station in a sleepy coastal town to call Thorn. It was the last outpost of civilization before the final stretch of desolate road. "I'm going in, Marcus," she said, her voice even, leaving no room for argument. "Claire, for God's sake, don't do this." His voice crackled over the phone, a mixture of anger and genuine fear. "We're already mobilizing. We can have a chopper there in 30 minutes. By then it will be too late," she countered calmly. "He's expecting me. He invited me. If he sees a uniform, if he even suspects you're there, he will enact whatever final solution he's planned. You know that. He needs his narrative to play out perfectly. Let me be the final chapter." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. She could picture him, rubbing his tired eyes, weighing his duty against her terrifyingly sound logic. "My team will be behind you, Claire," he finally said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Out of sight, but we will be there. You give us the signal. Any signal." "There won't be a signal, Marcus," she said softly. "Just get Lily out." She hung up before he could reply. The last 10 miles of the drive were on a narrow, crumbling asphalt road that hugged the cliffside. To her left, the Pacific Ocean churned, a furious expanse of gray and white foam crashing against jagged black rocks below. To her right, nothing but windswept grass and stunted, hardy trees. It felt like the edge of the world. And then she saw it. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, a structure decommissioned for over half a century, stood on a formidable basalt sea stack, connected to the mainland by a narrow, decaying causeway. It rose from the churning water like a stone finger pointing an accusation at the stormy sky. It was a monument of magnificent, defiant isolation, a perfect reflection of Julian Croft himself. She parked her car at the edge of the cliff where the road ended. The wind whipped her hair across her face and stole the breath from her lungs. She took a moment, looking at the formidable structure before her. She was not a cop. She was not a negotiator. She was a 60-year-old retired doctor, a widow who had come to Oregon seeking peace. But her entire life had, in some strange way, been a preparation for this moment. It was a diagnosis. The patient was the most complex and dangerous she had ever faced, and the disease was a sickness of the soul. With a final, deep breath of the salt-laced air, she stepped out of her car and began the long walk across the causeway, toward the lighthouse standing sentinel on the edge of the world. The heavy iron door of the lighthouse groaned open under Claire's push, revealing a spiraling cast-iron staircase that ascended into the gloom. The air inside was cold and still, thick with the scent of sea salt, damp stone, and something else, the faint, sterile odor of antiseptic. Julian's obsession with cleanliness had followed him even to this desolate rock. As the door clanged shut behind her, plunging the base of the tower into near darkness, she felt a profound sense of crossing a point of no return. There was no turning back now. She began to climb, her footsteps echoing in the cylindrical space. With each upward turn, the roar of the ocean outside became more distant, replaced by a tense, humming silence. She passed several empty landings, each swept clean, devoid of any sign of life. She was not being ambushed. This was not a physical trap. It was an ascension, a pilgrimage to the inner sanctum where the high priest of order held his court. She found them at the very top, in the lantern room. It was a circular space encased in glass, offering a breathtaking, panoramic view of the furious ocean. The storm had intensified, and waves crashed against the sea stack below, sending plumes of white spray high into the air. The room itself was a study in bizarre domesticity. A small table was set for two with simple white china. A portable heater glowed in one corner, casting a warm, orange light. And in the center of it all stood Julian Croft. He was dressed as she had seen him in photos in simple, well-pressed trousers and a dark cashmere sweater. He looked less like a kidnapper and more like a university professor hosting a seminar. Beside him, huddled in a thick blanket, sat Lily Harrison. The girl's face was pale and drawn, her eyes fixed on the tumultuous sea outside. She looked like a captive bird, too terrified to even test the bars of her cage. "Dr. Bishop," Julian said, his voice calm and melodic, without a trace of malice. He gestured to the empty chair at the table. "I'm so glad you could make it. I was just explaining to Lily the beautiful, immutable logic of the tides. Predictable, powerful, uncorrupted by sentiment." Claire did not sit. She remained standing by the entrance to the room, creating a space between them. "Let her go, Julian," she said, her voice steady. Julian smiled, a thin, pitying expression. "Let her go where? Back to them? To a father lost in his own guilt and a mother who flinches at shadows? To a brother who has already been seduced by the chaotic attachments of your world?" He shook his head slowly. "They are broken. Here, she can be whole. Here, there is only the truth of the structure I provide." "The truth is, you're terrified," Claire said, her voice dropping to a near-clinical tone. She was no longer speaking to a monster, but to a patient. "This elaborate world you've built, this obsession with order and control, it's all a fortress to protect you from one simple thing: your own feelings. You don't fear the world's chaos, Julian. You fear your own." For the first time, a flicker of something annoyance, perhaps, crossed Julian's serene features. "You presume to understand me, doctor? You, who spent your life patching up the messy, physical consequences of that chaos." "I spent my life listening to people in pain," she corrected him gently. "And I hear audibus of pain in you. Pain you've been running from your entire life. You didn't build a sanctuary for Sarah or for Lily. You built it for the scared little boy inside of you who couldn't control the world around him, so he decided to build a smaller, more manageable one." She saw Lily's head turn slightly at her words. The girl's gaze shifted from the sea to Claire, a spark of curiosity in her frightened eyes. "You read the great Stoic philosophers," Claire continued, taking a slow, deliberate step into the room. "I saw the books in your apartment. Marcus Aurelius, Seneca. They taught that the goal was to achieve inner peace, to be impervious to the whims of fortune. But you've misinterpreted them. They weren't advocating for the elimination of emotion. They were advocating for its mastery. They understood that love, grief, fear, these are not weaknesses. They are the very things that make us human. You haven't mastered your feelings, Julian. You've merely locked them in a basement, just as you locked away your family." "They are not my family." Julian's voice cracked, the first break in his carefully controlled facade. "My family understands that connection is a vulnerability, that love is a form of contamination. Is that what you told yourself when you took Sarah?" Claire pressed, her voice still soft, but relentless. "A woman you profess to admire? You didn't admire her, Julian. You coveted her. You wanted to own her, to freeze her in time like a butterfly in a glass case, safe from a world you felt she didn't deserve. But people aren't art, Julian. They are meant to be messy and free." Lily was now watching the exchange intently. She looked at her captor, then back at Claire, her mind visibly processing the two opposing worldviews laid bare before her. She was seeing the bars of her cage for the first time. Julian began to pace the small room, his composure unraveling. "You think you are so clever. You think you can deconstruct me with your pop psychology." He stopped and turned to her, his eyes burning with a feverish light. "But you fail to grasp the finality of the design. This place, this lighthouse, it's not just a sanctuary. It's a tomb. A perfect, final resting place, sealed off from a world that has failed." He moved swiftly to a small, unassuming metal panel on the wall and wrenched it open. Inside was a complex wiring system and a small, red button. "I had hoped to have more time," he said, his voice now strained, breathless. "Time for Lily to understand. Time for you to bear witness. But your world and its noise have followed us even here. If we cannot have perfection in life, we will have it in a clean, orderly end." He was going to destroy the lighthouse with all of them inside. Lily let out a small, terrified cry. This was not the protector she knew. This was a madman. "Julian, don't," Claire pleaded, taking another step. But it was too late. His finger moved toward the button. In that split second, a primal, ferocious roar erupted from the stairwell. The door to the lantern room, which had been left slightly ajar, burst open. A black ant-in blur of fur and fury launched itself across the room. Max. He had somehow gotten out of the car, had crossed the causeway, and climbed the winding stairs, drawn by an instinct more powerful than any locked door. He slammed into Julian, not at his legs, but at his chest, his training as a K-9 focusing on disarming a threat. The impact sent Julian stumbling backward, away from the control panel. He cried out in shock and pain as Max's teeth grazed his arm. The element of surprise was total. The carefully ordered world of Julian Croft had just been invaded by the one thing he could never predict: the wild, chaotic loyalty of an animal. The sound of a helicopter's rotors suddenly beat against the glass of the lantern room, and figures began rappelling down from above. Thorn had kept his promise. The chaos Julian feared so much had arrived, not as a whisper, but as a thundering storm, and his perfect, silent world was about to be torn apart. The chaos that Julian Croft had spent his life trying to contain erupted in the small, glass-encased room at the top of the world. The roar of the helicopter, the shattering of a glass pane as a SWAT officer swung inside, the sharp, authoritative commands, it was the cacophony of the world rushing in to reclaim its own. In the center of it all, Max stood his ground over a stunned and defeated Julian, a low, rumbling growl his final statement on the matter. The man who had built impenetrable walls had been brought down not by force of arms, but by the unwavering loyalty of a dog and the relentless compassion of a woman who refused to meet his madness with anything but reason. Thorn was the first one to reach Claire. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his face a mask of profound relief. "Are you all right?" She could only nod, her gaze fixed on Lily. The young woman was huddled in the corner, trembling not with fear anymore, but with the violent, shuddering aftershocks of a lifetime of trauma being released. Claire went to her, bypassing the swarm of tactical officers. She knelt and wrapped her arms around the girl. She didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. She simply held her, providing a solid, human anchor in the swirling storm of her emotions, as Lily finally began to weep, not the silent, hopeless tears of a captive, but the raw, cathartic sobs of a survivor. The journey back from the coast was a blur. Julian was taken into custody, his face a blank mask, his perfect world shattered into a million pieces. He was no longer a philosopher king, just a deeply disturbed man who would now be subject to the very systems he so despised. Claire sat in the back of an ambulance with Lily, while Max, hailed as a hero, rode up front with a paramedic who kept marveling at his intelligence. Months passed. The frenzied media attention faded, as it always does, leaving behind the long, quiet work of healing. The story of the lighthouse captor became another dark chapter in Oregon's history, but for those who had lived it, the story was just beginning. Autumn settled over Lake Oswego, draping the town in hues of gold and crimson. The air grew crisp, and the scent of wood smoke hung in the evenings. The house on Oak Creek Drive was no longer a place of haunting echoes, but a quiet sanctuary of recovery. Claire had found that her retirement was not to be an epilogue, but a new chapter, one she had never anticipated. She had, in a sense, become a different kind of doctor. The Harrison family did not return to the house. It held too many ghosts. They moved into a specialized facility where a team of therapists worked with them daily. Their progress was slow, uneven, and deeply personal. David, the silent father, began speaking again, first in therapy, then to his wife. He was grappling with a decade of helplessness, learning to forgive himself for not being able to protect his family from a threat he could never have imagined. Sarah picked up a violin again. At first, she could only hold it, the familiar weight a painful reminder of the art that had been silenced. But one day, she drew the bow across the strings, and a single, wavering note filled the air, a sound of profound, fragile hope. Lily struggled the most with the sheer, overwhelming freedom of the world. The simple act of choosing what to eat for breakfast could trigger a panic attack. But she found her anchor in art therapy, filling canvases not with the rigid lines Julian had admired, but with wild, chaotic splashes of color, an expression of the messy, beautiful emotions he had tried to extinguish. It was Leo who found his path most clearly. His bond with Max had been the key that unlocked his voice, and he refused to be separated from the dog. Thorn, in a final act of compassionate justice before his retirement, had bent every rule in the book to have Max officially decommissioned from police evidence and permanently assigned to Leo as a therapeutic support animal. The boy and the dog were inseparable. They spent their days walking the trails around the lake, Leo slowly relearning the textures of the world, the rough bark of a pine tree, the cool dampness of moss, the warmth of the sun on his face, with his steadfast friend at his side. One crisp October afternoon, Claire was sitting on her porch swing, a warm mug of tea in her hands, watching the leaves fall. A familiar pair came walking up her driveway. Leo, looking taller and more confident than she had ever seen him, with Max trotting happily beside him. "We brought you something," Leo said, his voice stronger now, more certain. He handed her a small, wrapped canvas. Claire unwrapped it carefully. It was a painting by Lily. It depicted a lighthouse, but not the menacing, isolated tower on the cliff. This lighthouse was bathed in the warm, golden light of a sunrise. The sea around it was calm, and a flock of birds was soaring into a clear blue sky. It was a painting not of imprisonment, but of liberation. "She wanted you to have it," Leo said. She said you were the one who opened the window." Claire felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. She looked at the painting, then at the young man standing before her, a survivor who was slowly, painstakingly piecing together a future from the fragments of his past. She looked at Max, the old warrior now enjoying a well-deserved peace, his tail giving a gentle thump-thump against the porch steps. She had come to this house seeking an escape from the echoes of her own life, only to be drawn into the deafening silence of another's. She had thought her life's work of healing was over, but she had been wrong. Healing wasn't just about setting bones and stitching wounds. It was about listening. It was about bearing witness. It was about having the courage to walk into the darkness with someone and remind them that light still existed, even if they couldn't see it yet. As the sun began to set, casting long, peaceful shadows across the lawn, Claire Bishop felt a sense of rightness settle over her, as comfortable and familiar as a well-worn coat. The emptiness she had once felt in her heart and in her home was gone. It had been filled, not with noise or chaos, but with the quiet, resilient hum of life moving forward. The house on Oak Creek Drive finally had its soul back. And so, she realized, had she? And so, the quiet life Claire Bishop sought was finally found, not in solitude, but in the echoes of a story that will forever bind her to the Harrison family and to the loyal, four-legged hero who heard their cries when no one else could. But now, I turn the story over to you. What do you think of Claire's final decision to confront Julian alone? Would you have done something different if you were in her shoes? Was it an act of profound courage or a reckless gamble? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I truly do read every single one. Your perspectives bring these stories to life in ways I could never imagine on my own. If this story made you think or made you feel, please don't forget to leave a like, share it with someone you believe would be moved by it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery we uncover together. I'll see you in the next story, and who knows, perhaps the next time, you'll be the one to tell a buried truth.